Hello and welcome back to the Witching Hour. On this episode we will be discussing early modern literature and primary sources such as Macbeth and other Shakespeare plays. Today we have with us our classic children, the Wicked Witch of the South, Wicked Witch of the East and Wicked Witch of the West. Say hello everyone.
Hello, I'm the Witch of the South.
Hi, I'm East.
Hi, I'm West.
Okay, so today we shall be discussing, first and foremost, the witches in Macbeth. So, since everyone has at least seen or watched the play, what did you think? What were the kind of general assumptions that you got about the witches in Macbeth? Any stereotypes there, maybe?
They weren't considered as normal women would have been considered in the time period. They were said to have gluten fingers and that they dressed crazily, and that's not what you'd normally get from a woman in that time era.
Do you think it's kind of like an exaggerated stereotype then, or do you think kind of we just assume that because of modern day kind of stereotypes that exist, or do you think those stereotypes like existed in the early modern period as well?
I don't think they did exist because Macbeth seemed very shocked by it.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Have you got any kind of like key quotations or anything that you thought about the witches that kind of like highlighted what they're presented as?
Well, they're presented as having choppy finger laying upon her skinny lips, and that they're so withered and so wild in their attire.
So you kind of mentioned that they're kind of removed from the stereotypical feminine role. Do you feel like the witches in Macbeth are less gendered almost?
Yeah.
So they're removed from their gender. Because obviously we've looked at the genders of witches each time, and as we know, 20% of witches were actually male. So do you think it's obvious that the witches in Macbeth are female or male, or do you think like it's quite ambiguous?
They are said to have beards, and that does relate to a male, but they also are described as female.
That's fair enough. What else have we got?
What generally stands out to you guys then? So you guys who are a bit less familiar with Macbeth, what do you think about the idea of witches and this idea that they are very almost manly as we've discussed so far? What do you think about that? Where do you think that comes from?
You go.
It's very, like it's been said, they're less gendered, but also they're usually quite aged up. And I think that could link to the fact that people didn't like magic, so stereotypically men probably wouldn't be attracted to older, gross-looking women.
Do you know why older women were perceived as witches or not? It's fine if not. No? Basically, it's because they had more life experience.
I just got
Believe it or not. So yeah, they had kind of more life experience in terms of they'd been around more, and as a result, because to persecute a witch you needed evidence, and obviously the longer you'd been somewhere, the more evidence you would have. So yeah, but also that kind of sense of attraction as well. I think in terms of marriage, depending on which class you were in, I think people were getting married as young as 12. For women, it was also a lot younger as well, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was usually once you'd started menstruating, wasn't it?
Yeah. Although sometimes earlier if it was like trade agreements, things like that, because obviously women were kind of traded about, which isn't the nicest, but it's how it was.
We don't do any objectification, but yeah, it did happen, which is quite sad.
Okay, one other thing is, have you guys ever thought about like how the idea of any promiscuity or things like that might also link to witches? So these were, really not very nice looking ladies who weren't very attractive to men. And how do you think like attractiveness actually played into that, and how their appeal was, mixed about? Because we've had very mixed reviews in media at times. Sometimes you get the idea of the siren, who's more magic in that way and linked to magic and in their attractiveness, but witches are very much on the flip side in media, and why that's gone that way and why women are portrayed like that.
Well, back then, women were expected to marry. So if they weren't married, they would already not be very well liked. So they were probably quite a good scapegoat for people to be accusing them.
So is the argument then, do you think, is it an attack on women then? Like in early modern literature, do you think the attack is on women?
Yes, because although there was cases of men accused, the massive majority is purely women.
Do you know any other literature that's kind of early modern literature that's got witchcraft or magic in general in it?
And if not early modern, just any infamous witches in writing that you know about. I'll give you an example. So you've got like the White Witch from The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, which is obviously a lot more modern, but if you look at how she's written, there's a lot of interesting parallels between our old media and our new media. So anything like that. If you ever read like a Sabrina the Teenage Witch comic and things like that as well, any of that popular media.
Well, there's The Wizard of Oz,
Mm-hmm.
And that has the two contrasting witches.
Yeah.
There's also
There's the Worst Witch, where the two head teachers are contrasting as well.
Yeah.
Technically, through our name,
Mm-hmm.
Scarlet Witch is
Yeah,
a witch.
that's a really popular one. I'm glad you picked up on that.
But she's not very. She definitely doesn't fit the older stereotype.
Mm-hmm. You say that, but if we actually unpick her, if you have a little look at her character arc, yeah, she's super modernized, she's cool, she's technically a superhero. But if you look into like different depictions of Scarlet Witch across all the comics and things like that, she is a foreigner, for example. So first of all, she's not from that area, so she's classed as foreign or alien to them almost, which is a very common thing we find with witches. She's also demonized for her powers and her magic, so she's quite often excluded for that, or picked upon for having those powers. So she does, in some ways, fit some of those old stereotypes. But we'll pull back to the Wizard of Oz. When you think of the witches in the Wizard of Oz and the two parallels, what do you think of when you think of the bad witch? What pops into your head straight away?
Evil.
Mm-hmm.
Her pointy nose.
Yep, the pointy nose. What about the colour of her skin?
Slightly yellow.
I'm going to say she's like a yellowy green, I think, at that point as well, which we're going to touch upon. And you'll see that in our other episodes. So if you guys go back and listen, you'll be able to pick up on that. And we've talked about that in episode 1. Okay.
Just to touch on kind of like the early modern stuff again. I know Shakespeare, obviously we have spoke about Macbeth earlier and previously, but I also want to think about this idea of witches being entwined by with magic. Because if you think about it, there's several Shakespeare plays that involve, if not witches, they will definitely involve magic. If you think about it, you always have these kind of ruling class men, and for some reason they seek witches or magic to help improve their kind of hold on the patriarchy, essentially. So would you naturally associate witches with magic, or do you think they're two separate entities and by accident they've been combined? Like, do you think any of like the witchcraft stuff's real, or is it a bit of a stretch?
I think witches and magic do go together, but I think they go together because earlier on they've been combined together by accident, and then we've just got that as a stereotype as witches and magic.
Mm-hmm.
I think it also partly depends on your definition of magic, because you could, if it's that.
There's a difference between magic, as in like magic tricks,
Yeah.
and then magic that's not.
So the idea of illusion versus like spell casting and things like that, yeah? Okay. Definitely. One other thing you guys could probably think about and that you might not have connected before is the idea of like apothecary. So herbalists and healers and things like that were usually women, but that obviously then sometimes meant that they were demonized if something went on that people couldn't explain. So looking at that kind of thing, if you've got someone who's fallen ill, your apothecarist, who was previously an innocent old lady who lives in the woods, is now suddenly a Satan-feeling woman who's disappeared into the depths. And there's a lot of that there. Have you guys ever looked at religion as well to do with things like this?
I read that quite a lot of accusations of witchcraft didn't actually stem from the church. It was quite often just due to personal rivalries and vendettas.
Yeah, you'd be on the right lines. So there was a little bit of religious bias, especially in America. It was a lot more prevalent abroad. But there was definitely that religious bias everywhere, with a little bit of the witch's mark being called like the devil's mark, things like that. So the witch's mark existed in the idea of if you made a deal with the devil, when you sold your soul or things like that, you would get a mark from him, so you'd be bitten by him or scratched by him. And it was also called a flea bite occasionally. When you look at that, if we unpick that that's not always a religious connotation, you can also look at it, like you said, with the rivalries, the social aspects, the class and the gender all played into it. So, for example, if one of your neighbours, if all their chickens laid eggs and your chicken didn't lay any eggs, you might think that your neighbour's cursed you, or you might not actually think it, but you might go accusing them to the Witchfinder General and steal a chicken. And that's that kind of thing. So it definitely makes sense.
Chicken is a good meat.
Exactly. And you need those eggs in those days. You don't have much going.
Exactly. So naturally there we've just talked about kind of foreign affairs in witchcraft. However, I would like to move on and address the fact that there was actually witches right on our own doorstep. Well, witches, I'm going to put that in inverted commas because, yeah. So there was like a newspaper type thing around Newcastle called the General Magazine. It was essentially a magazine, but it was written as kind of a newspaper. And the source that I have is from October 1749. And what we're going to do is I'm going to read some quotes out from it for you. And what I'd like you to do is kind of just think about not only what interpretation it gives from society, so think about how society is perceiving witchcraft, but also how these people were perceived. Because essentially what this source does is it almost acts like a guide for the people of Newcastle, who at this point aren't all literate, to see what kind of things they should be looking out for in terms of women. Okay, and just a reminder as well for our listeners, all our resources are available on our blog if you'd like to follow along with us. Okay, so the first section is, I'll read it out because it's in early modern English, which is great. So it says, it was not a very hard task to persuade the already deluded that there were men, women and children who had bodily intercourse with the invisible world. Okay, so let's break that down. Who are they talking about when they mention the already deluded?
Isn't that like the people who are reading it?
Mm-hmm. So what is this writer saying about his own people?
That they've already been tricked to think something else and they don't think straight.
Exactly. So is this media source, like, does it believe in witchcraft?
Yeah.
Are you sure?
No, because it's calling those that do believe it deluded.
Exactly. So basically there is already that divide in society that people don't think they are. And what about the idea of bodily intercourse with the invisible world? What is it suggesting?
Is that like a deal with the devil?
Yeah, essentially. So they're basically saying they're having sex with the devil and Satan
And
and the odd goat.
in terms of the idea of the sexuality of it and making it a very sexual act, why do we think they're demonizing that? Is that to kind of shame, do we think?
Is it? Yeah, because back then that wasn't a very big thing. You wouldn't, unless you're married, it was
So
a sin.
it was very much, we were very prudent back then. It was very shameful. So it's very much, even though they are talking about the public being deluded, the idea of witchcraft itself is already very shamefully connotated by this writer that we've got here.
Let's see what other quotes do they have. What about, this is interesting, killers of mankind and such are witches. Killers of mankind. First off, mankind. Can we just establish that? I know we're quite a feminist podcast, but what's wrong with humankind? Like, I'm sorry, like, what is wrong with humankind? It's to me, that is definitely condemning females and only females, despite the fact that we've already addressed 20% of witches were in fact men. When I say 20% of witches, I mean 20% of those accused.
Yes.
I think it's quite important because, to be fair, there could have been millions. We just will never know.
Mm-hmm.
But the historiography that we do have suggests that 20% were men. So what do we think then? Killers of mankind. How are they killing men? Is witchcraft feminist? There we go. What do we think?
Well, it's kind of linking to the fact that, like, the gender inequality, because witches were most likely more powerful than men, and that was not a thing, considering that they were usually depicted as women, that would be accepted.
Exactly, yeah. What about I've got another quotation here. Perhaps we make the devil fond of old women on purpose to sure that we will keep all the young ones to ourselves. That is a beautiful quotation.
Nice and possessive. Very creepy.
Got a bit ownership there. Wicked Witch of the South. What do you think about that? Who do you think that's blaming? Do you think that's blaming the witches for this idea of them being tempted by the devil, or do you think that's society being blamed?
I think that's them blaming the witches for being tempted and not strong enough or something.
Yeah.
So very weak-willed and not very strong. Yeah, that's a good idea.
I mean, on the flip side, you could argue it is society as well, because I mean, it's arguing that we've pushed the old ones out for the new.
The old biddies are on the edge and they're takeable, so Satan's had them. Is basically what this writer.
It's like, you know that scene in Snow White at the very end where she's given her the poison apple or something, and she's like running away, and she's on the cliff edge, and she's like, oh. No, I haven't seen that. It is just me on that one then.
A little bit of an age gap on Snow White there, but that's absolutely fine.
I mean, it was the 1937 version I was quoting, never mind. Last quotation from this source then, and we will move on. So, the old woman has always for her companion an old grey cat, which is a disguised devil too. Can we relate that to today?
It's the cat's the familiar, and even now in media, they usually have some form of animal.
As well, I feel like women today, if you're single, it's like, oh, you're going to end up single with 10 cats. Do you know what I mean? There's still that thing there about cats. And I must say, my cat is lovely.
When we were talking earlier to you guys about witches' marks as well, there's not a great example in here, but say example like any dimples or moles, things like that. As well as being called witches' marks, you did also occasionally have them being called teats for familiars, or familiars bites, basically. So it was that the idea was that witches would feed their familiars, that they produced milk out of a foreign teat that they produced when they became witches, and they would actually feed like their familiars, which were represented as cats, but quite often were also meant to be like demons or evil spirits that weren't actually the animals they had. They were kind of a representative of that evil bond that we had going.
Yeah, just to mention, we have moved on to our Hans Baldung Witches 1508 wood carving, and this kind of wood carving was meant to almost epitomise what it was to be a witch. So this is to show all the stereotypes of what it would be to be a witch. So do you think we can point out 5?
Generally, they're not skinny.
No, I've never thought of that.
Which a stereotype of woman was to be skinny
Mm-hmm.
and petite, and they're not.
So in this portrayal, they're very like, I don't want to call them frumpy, but they're very made out to not be very smooth and very bumpy, and their skin seems uneven and very, very off in this portrayal. So they've been made out to be very like, but that could also be wrinkles for age. So bear that in mind. But very not smooth, very impure. There. What else do you guys pick out?
They're not wearing clothes, so they're being portrayed as almost unmodest.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of female nakedness also is entwined with the idea of temptation and being seduced by the devil. So this idea of female sexuality, essentially, as well. What do we notice at the top? There's 2 things at the top that I do want to point out.
There's someone riding a goat, which is generally kind of like demon-like or
Yes.
Satan.
Yeah.
So it is believed that the devil does take the form of a goat, which explains why a farm wants the goat to call my food. I'm not a fan of goats. What about the way the witch is sitting upon the goat? Which way is it? Forwards, backwards, left, right?
It's not. It's sat backwards, so not riding it, just kind of using it for somewhere to sit.
So the idea of inversion, that witchcraft was backwards, essentially, so it was against the norm. And lastly, before we leave this, what do we notice that they are surrounded? What are they surrounding in the middle? What are they doing? What is that stereotype? She's got her spoon and she's... Yeah, making potions, magical spells. So yeah, we've got that idea of like stirring the pot, the cauldron, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think on this episode we've came full circle now. We've looked at stereotypes, we've looked at Macbeth, we've done early modern. We've really been through it all. So yeah, so we're going to leave this episode here. Thank you all for listening and partaking. So we will see you shortly in episode 4. Bye everyone.
Bye.
Bye.